All right, it is 3 past the hour, 7:03 here on the East Coast. So I will give a couple of announcements and housekeeping things, and then we will get into the real event. So as I said before, I'll say again, my name is Will Pfeffer. I use he and him pronouns. I am a senior program manager on the network team at Code for America. I am based in Boston, Massachusetts. So this is our last Brigade workshop of 2020. The second one that we've done as a book talk. Last month we had a book talk with Ray Brescia from Albany Law School, and today we're going to be talking with Cyd Harrell. Before we get started, we do have a code of conduct that governs the expectations of how folks behave at this and all Code for America events. I will post a link to that and one or two other things in the chat as soon as I'm done speaking. But the expectation is that this is open, safe, welcoming space for everybody. And if you haven't been to a Code for America event in the past, if you're not familiar with the code of conduct, I would ask you to take a look at it. We are also in the middle of doing some theory of change work at Code for America, especially or specifically on the network team, thinking about what we as the Brigade network are trying to accomplish in the world. There is a group working on that. That's a group of staff, Brigade leaders, and Brigade volunteers. If you would like to participate in that, there is a survey, sort of a survey. It's on a tool called Polis, which you can rate how much you agree and disagree with certain statements that describe your brigade, describe what your brigade is trying to be, and describe what you want your brigade to be. I'll also post a link to that. And I believe you can find some more, you can find many of the people working on that in the Brigade channel on the Code for America Slack. And then finally, for folks who are joining and are Brigade leaders, just a reminder that the deadline to sign your MOUs, I believe, is today. So make sure you get those signed, and please fill out the end of your survey. That will help us track our own metrics as the network team. But as I mentioned in an email about that, we'll be producing annual reports for each of the brigades that you can use to share some of your work with community partners, potential funders, things like that. So please do fill that stuff out and remember to sign your MOU. So how this will work, I will ask Cyd to speak a bit about her book, and then I think we'll spend the majority of our time together in conversation. There are enough people that it is probably not feasible to make everybody a panelist. We won't all fit on one screen, which is lovely to see so many people attending. So I think what we will do, we can do questions in the chat, but I think the best way to do things once we're into the Q&A section is going to be to use the raise hand function that will allow me to unmute you. Just a reminder when we do move into that part that we are recording the session. So if you would prefer not to have your voice or face recorded, you're of course welcome to send me your question in chat, and I can ask it for you. So with that, I will post those code of conduct and theory of change links in the chat, and I will turn things over to Cyd to start talking about her book.
Hi, yeah, thanks Will for the intro, and thanks for setting this up as mostly a Q&A. I did want to share a little bit. Oh, it looks like host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, sorry about that. I will.
No sweat.
There we go. You should be able to do that. No.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay. So I thought to this audience, all of you people who've already been participating in Civic Tech as part of the brigades or other things, I wouldn't presume to sort of come here and tell you how to do things, but I'd talk a little bit about the book and why I wrote it and why I think probably everybody on this call should write a book when the right time comes for them. First of all, hello again. A lot of you have been with Code for America probably as long as I have. I think I saw Carlos from Tulsa go by, so hi, and a couple of other names that I knew for sure. My first slide, because this is a meme recently, is my first ever posted at an unconference that was Code for America associated, which was City Camp San Francisco in 2011. And I came to that weekend event thinking, well, they might toss me out because I don't exactly code, but maybe I'll try and teach people some basic research stuff. And the post-it says, user experience, citizen experience, how to get ideas and data from the public, and how to get the design and research community involved. Probably the reason I'm still in Civic Tech is because actually 35 people came to that session and asked a lot of questions. So give it 9 years or so, and I published my little book in September, which is called a Civic Technologist Practice Guide. I'm a Code for America staff alumni. I mentored fellows for a long time, but was actually on the staff from 2013 to 15, working on UX and then product. And since then, I spent a term at 18F and have been working with the California courts since 2018. Now, I still encounter the kind of reactions we all get when we contact a new government partner. I came to the courts fresh off of my federal term, and I introduced myself and said, I've got a good bit of government experience and I'm excited to learn about you. And they said, so why are you telling us about your government experience? And as I said, we're here in a government building and you all have .gov emails, and I thought we were about to do a government design project. They said, well, we're not the government, we're the courts. There's a really good reason for my partners at the courts to feel like they can't identify with the word government, even though we were sitting in a government building, and they do all have .gov on their email addresses, which is actually that very often the government is a party before the courts. And so if they identified as part of the government, they don't feel like it would be fair and equitable to other people who bring cases before them. So it was interesting being bounced once again into the sort of, you're completely new. And I've spent a couple of years learning about why the courts are a really important component of our practicing our rights and pursuing our aims in this country. So that's one thing that I'm delighted to talk about more and answer questions about. But I have to bring up this big question, and I'm not here to tell any of you that there is one right way to do this, but I thought I would share a couple of the definitions that I talk about in my book, and we can see later if folks have improvements or more to suggest. I think that civic tech is about us as humans in this country wanting to access services and exercise rights and build our communities with the ease and with the respect for our time and our abilities that really good digital technology can offer us. I also think it's about not catch up exactly, but being on a par with the private sector. So we want public digital goods, and we want those things to be as good as the digital goods that we can get from all kinds of commercial entities, from Amazon to Google. And to do that, we need public digital infrastructure as well as private digital infrastructure. So there's a lot in our remit as civic technologists. And there are a whole lot of different ways to engage. And I'm guessing some of this will be familiar, but I created kind of a rubric to say, well, what are the broad categories of projects in which we as a community might be able to share learnings with each other? So we can talk about what a service delivery project needs. So things like working on unemployment applications or Get CalFresh that a lot of you might be familiar with in the Code for America network, or the work that USDS did on improving customs and immigration applications during the previous administration, as the feds like to say. There's a lot of infrastructure work, and I think this often falls to brigade type organizations in terms of opening data. That's one of the key infrastructure plays, but you often have to be inside to work on government APIs between departments or cloud services or that sort of stuff. There's a whole civic startup ecosystem and an ecosystem of other vendors that wouldn't call themselves civic startup that build tools specifically for government. And then there are beautiful mutual aid organizations like StreetMix or recovers.org, to name a couple, that came out of the Code for America ecosystem back in the 2010s. And there's the whole set of things around citizen engagement, whether with planning or voting or other deliberative processes or finding who your rep is and how to get information to them. And each of these types of projects kind of needs a solidified practice around it, where people who have learned and done the research, figured out how to get the project launched, understood where the private sector can play best and where things have to be internal, can kind of come together and identify these are practices that work, so that the next set of people who want to work on the next service or the next set of tools can benefit from what they learned. I think all of you probably are familiar with the difficulty with figuring out what level and branch of government the issue that you want to work on lives at. I remember when we were working with Oakland back in 2013 and 14, one of the trickiest things on their website was that people would come and look for their birth certificate or their divorce record or something like that. And one of those things is held by the courts, and one of them is held by Alameda County because it's a vital record, which is a county level function rather than a city level function. One of the things we desperately need is to just make transparent, to ourselves within the civic tech movement and to Americans, who's doing what in the government. And then we face sets of questions like, can I actually act on the issue that I want to work on through technology means? Or is it something where I have to create the conditions through political means before it even makes sense for technology to play a role? So I talk a bit in the book about marijuana policy, which is a patchwork across our country of absolute prohibition to regulated medical use with varying degrees of stringency around the requirements to get a medical card, to recreational and full adult legality in about 5 or 6 states now. And I know that some of you have been involved in working on expungement of past marijuana convictions, which is a terrific benefit to the public. But in places where we still have a prohibition of that substance, it doesn't make sense to do more than a thought experiment and imagining what an expungement flow might look like and how the data might go from one agency to another, because you're not going to be able to build it until the policy gets in place. So there's sort of an interesting way of diagnosing, am I looking at a government agency that has an explicit policy against what I want to do? And therefore, do I want to look to something else right now? Or a messy policy that maybe could favor what I want to do depending on the administration's posture. Or this is like the biggest opportunity space is when there's a clear policy that favors your work, but there's a crummy implementation of it. Things like what was done with Get Cal Fresh, where there was a explicit California policy that everyone who was eligible for food aid from the federal government should be enrolled. And yet the application process involved multiple touch points, interviews, difficult forms, all kinds of things. There was a big space for tech to act. And then sometimes you have a new administrator who's excited to act and wants to work with you, but the policy isn't in place yet, which is an interesting and opportunistic but dicey situation, because if something happens to that person or their policy, your work can sometimes get wiped out. I like to think about levels, not just of the tech stack, but of the policy to technology to practice stack, really, at which we can work as civic technologists. And I always want to acknowledge everybody who does all these different kinds of work, from writing content to doing user research to designing templates or forms to actually coding or implementing technology, from CMSs to custom applications to integrating databases to changing regulations or getting the teams that need to work together to work more closely together, which I find when I'm inside an agency is what I spend probably 65% of my time on, is arranging meetings and talking with people. And yes, I'm bringing user research expertise, but I'm also just suggesting that we go talk to this guy across the hall or in that other Zoom meeting right now. And if you're sort of feeling this as I'm talking about it, a lot of people who are experienced civic technologists think about these things fairly automatically as they go about their business. But for people who are new to the field, it's relatively opaque to figure out the answers to all of these sets of questions. How do I use my skills to do this kind of good? How can I have a reasonable prediction that the work that I put my time into is actually going to have an effect on some member of the public that I want to affect at some point, or help some public servant have their job be easier and give them more capacity to do more for the public? These are all the things that we have to go through and think about. And my project in writing the book was kind of to make some of these things explicit that we all are running around with in our heads, and see if we could then offer this to folks who are new or who are just rethinking about how they work in the field, as one way to think about our work, which they could then build on or disagree with on. So the ultimate question is on all these axes, what policy position, what level of government, what specific type of project, what piece of the stack, where would I act as a civic technologist if I want to relieve the most pain for end users, members of the public, or if I want to relieve pain and free up capacity for people who are maintaining applications and stewarding funds, or if I want to make my changes actually last past maybe my own engagement of a year or a couple of years with an agency, or to make sure that I actually have partnership and access and support to do the work. Making these choices often determines, even more than whether our idea is really good, how far we're going to get with a civic tech project. So when I started thinking about writing a book myself, I thought we really need a shelf of books. And we have a little one that is starting. I think these are most of the books out there right now that would consider themselves explicitly civic tech books, although there are a couple of others by civic tech people. I'm counting the Marianne Bellotti book that is coming out next year about legacy systems as a civic tech book, because that topic by a USDS alum seems like it's probably going to be pretty civic tech inflected. And I could have probably included Lou Downs' book about good services and service design. But these are just a few books. And if we're thinking about a path for junior people, which could be taking several classes during their training that are explicitly about civic tech or that deal with government tech as a section, we don't really have enough books to offer those professors to adopt for those yet. And yes, professors will work with blog posts and articles, but books are an interesting piece of solidity for a field to gain. I want, and I think all of you probably want, more people to become civic technologists. And there are a lot of things to join now. This is so different from 10 years ago. I become excited every time I see this, and every time I meet somebody who isn't a connection of a connection for me, who is just new to the field and has come to it through another path. It's a real sign of incredible strength. And I think in particular that we are seeing more and more people from different backgrounds, from younger age groups, and from different past career paths show up and be excited about doing this. But we don't want to turn them all off with a first project that fails or an inability to figure out how the heck they can contribute. So I want, in particular, for new civic technologists to be able to skip some of the mistakes I made. And maybe some of you were with me in making a few of those, and make some more advanced ones so that we can figure our way out of those as well. I think to do this, we don't just need a shelf of books. We need a network of archives, and we need academic partners. This needs to become a subject that is studied. And we're starting to see that with some of the centers at the Kennedy School at Harvard and the Beck Center at Georgetown, and potentially with the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure that Ethan Zuckerman is starting at UMass Amherst, that we are starting to get some institutional existence and concern and attention to civic tech. So that's really exciting. And we need enough support and enough ease of figuring out what to do that people aren't shredded by their first couple of projects in this field. That's been something that I've thought about a lot recently. I have burned out myself. I have had a lot of colleagues that have burned out. And on the whole, I have to reflect on my position as a person with a substantial degree of privilege and the likelihood that I am less susceptible to burnout than many people who are dealing with other major burdens like systemic racism or more burdensome care work than I do as a parent of a kid who is old enough to mostly take care of themselves. So making our field accessible to as many people as possible in terms of learning it, in terms of participating in it without kind of hurting yourself or getting too burned out to deal with other things in your life. These are all things we want, and these are all things that come from having an infrastructure. And I like to use a shelf of books as just a little representative of the things that we need as we kind of go on into our next decade. So that's why I wrote a book, and that's a little bit about the book. And I would love to just talk a bit.
All right. Well, thank you, Cyd. I appreciate the focus on entry points and looking at sort of where there are some entry points to be developed. I think that's, I mean, as someone who works on, one of the big entry points for folks getting into civic tech, that is really definitely something of interest to me. And also as someone who sort of, my original entry point was through working at universities that started working on this stuff. So it's cool to see some of that reflected. So if folks have questions, you have a couple of ways to ask them. I see one person has asked a question in the Q&A box already, which I will read out in a moment. You're also welcome to use the raise hand button down at the bottom of your screen. But Callum asks, as a junior designer, I'm eager to contribute to civic design efforts, but don't have hands-on experience with trauma-informed and co-design practices. Are there low-risk entry points where building hands-on experience is less likely to cause harm?
That's a great question. Yeah, how do you get a low-risk entry point to trauma-informed design? I would suggest that some of the classes from Creative Reaction Lab, many of which are inexpensive or some of which are free, are a great place to study up on that. But I do think it's recommended that as you start to do that kind of design, you work with a mentor on some of your first trauma-informed interviews. I am still working closely with a really experienced attorney in interviewing people, for example, getting domestic violence restraining orders, even though I have a lot of research experience. It's just a level of trauma that I haven't worked at before. Viviane Castillo's work is also fantastic, both in terms of doing good trauma-informed work and also in terms of what kind of self-care is required for researchers who spend significant time on that kind of work. There's a thing called secondary trauma, and I did a study this past summer for the National Conference on Citizenship with a group of researchers working on what's it actually like to be trying to get benefits at that point in the pandemic. And we definitely saw our research team take on some of the trauma that they heard about. And we used Viviane's work. Viviane also has a community called Humanity Centered that she started recently with Sakai Farai and Alba Villamil that is aiming to be kind of an alternate center of design practice from the very commercial hashtag design Twitter center of discussion and practice. So that's another great thing to look into.
Great. There was also, I saw a question in the chat earlier, just a request to share that book list. I know there is a resources list at the end of your book that has many more than just those books. But.
Yes, there is, but I can get those links to you, Will.
Great.
Yeah, I think the covers may not have had all of the titles and authors on them. I can speak it out. So It was Beyond Transparency, which of course is a Code for America book from 2013. And I think that's still at beyondtransparency.org. It was Andrew Schrock's book, which is just called Civic Tech. The Government Fix, which is part of a small, cool series of books about this, which is Hannah Schenk, and I'm now going to forget the second author because it is too far away for me to grab. my little book, and then the one that's coming out called Kill It With Fire by Marianne Bellotti.
Thank you. And we will, I'll upload the list of those titles. There's a post on the Code for America discourse page for this event where I'll upload the video of this once I get it posted to YouTube, and I can update it with those titles as well. Ted asks, what progress in civic tech do you expect for 2021? And especially, what effect on civic tech will the pandemic have made?
The pandemic has done some really interesting things. It's moved a lot of government agencies forward just in working with tech because they're having to work remotely. So there are people doing really service-oriented civic tech to just help governments get set up with Zoom and Calendly and basic modern productivity tech that most of you would think is baseline, but many government agencies haven't had in the last 10 years. So that's been an advance. You've seen interesting efforts to step in and fill government gaps, like for example, covidtracking.com, which is a huge effort started by a couple of journalists at The Atlantic and a UX practitioner named Aaron Kassan to initially just collect how much COVID testing was happening in the United States using journalistic techniques like calling all the public health departments, and now has evolved to be the basically default source of data on COVID infections, tests, and deaths in the United States. The government has never stepped up to provide this information under the Trump administration. And so this effort by people whose job it isn't quite, but who filled the gap, seems to me like that is actually a civic tech effort. The US digital response, which has been involved in a lot of those efforts to just help governments get able to do service in a digital channel, I think has been another really interesting effort. I've been to see several brigades operating, over Zoom, which I think, given the kind of hands-on work and collaboration brigades do, is really tough. But a lot of you, I want to shout out for continuing and helping the governments that you partner with in doing a lot of this. So my guess, and I think the other big factor is we have an incoming new federal administration. And Waldo Jaquith pointed out something pretty interesting on Twitter the other day, which is every agency landing team that's been announced by the transition has someone who is experienced with civic tech or federal government tech. And I saw a question about whether those are the same thing, and I think sometimes, and I'll talk about that. But an experienced person that the civic technology movement could probably claim as a fellow traveler in practice or ideology as part of every transition team. That likely means that federal civic tech is going to expand, and that's going to supercharge them. That has been starting to happen at the state level to create mini USDSs and mini 18Fs at a lot of states. And I think both of those can learn a lot from the municipal civic tech world. And I haven't convinced all of them yet, but I think they have fewer touch points with the public, and there is a lot that they can pick up from folks who work with municipal governments.
One little plug that I put in chat, but that I'll mention as those new organizations come online, is there's a public interest tech job board on the Code for America website.
That's a great resource. Yes.
Yeah, not all of the organizations use it, but it is something that I relied on in past job searches before I ended up working here. So I think it's a great resource. It's just jobs.codeforamerica.org. Speaking of which, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Apologies to folks in the Q&A, but there's a question in chat that's related. Amanda asks, do you have resources? Oh, my chat just jumped. Do you have resources you would recommend for organizations looking to hire junior folks in civic tech?
Coding It Forward and Code 2040 are both fantastic. Coding It Forward is explicitly focused towards civic tech, and they place college students in government internships during their college career. So they have a lot of experience with identifying and placing folks really early in their civic tech career. Code 2040 is more about transforming the tech industry, but has actually placed interns at Code for America in the past, and I think has some people who are civic tech interested as starting points.
Great. Just a quick reminder, you are also welcome to use the raise hand button. I would personally rather hear your voice asking your questions than mine, but so if you're comfortable doing that, you're welcome to. I'll ask a question from the chat here. Sam asks, what kinds of things do you think are best done by Code for America versus vendors like the Digital Services Coalition versus 18F or USDS versus within an agency or municipality itself? How should we split that work out?
Right. It's a terrific question. So one thing is the federal government can't really work with volunteers. It can get volunteers who are federal employees to detail to other kinds of work in emergencies, but for very good reasons, the federal government can't accept unpaid labor as a general thing. So if you want to work on anything federal beyond, say, an advisory board or something, you're going to need to join up. State and municipal have some more flexibility, and municipal governments are often able to partner pretty closely with volunteer organizations. I think some of the new school vendors are really interesting. The consultants like the Navas, the A1Ms, the Ad Hocs, the Trustworks. That ecosystem is at this point, I think, hiring almost as many technologists as the federal services. And so that's a really interesting one to watch. And there's starting to be more and more old school vendors who are thinking, well, I want to hire some people who worked this way because it looks like governments are starting to look for this. So which projects should be done which way? Volunteers are amazing at anything that has to do with advocacy, like let's try to get data opened up. Infrastructure projects where you have to work on something like security are incredibly hard to do as a volunteer. If you want to fix the .gov registry, you're just going to have to become a GSA employee. And in between, there's a lot of squish. Product strategies, I think, are really useful at the municipal level because if you sell something to San Francisco and Oakland, you've covered 2 of the approximately 3,000 municipalities in the country. And almost all of them, even though a lot of them are much smaller in scale, need to do a lot of the same things. They need to respond to public records requests and have a planning process and book people for classes with their recreation department and check things out of the library and all of those things that we're familiar with as a city set of responsibilities. So I think companies or really robust open source projects are terrific for those, calling those product strategies in general. And then the consulting companies have a hard time with that. I think they're much more organized right now to work at the state and federal level. And federal folks, I don't know how many of you are on the call, but federal folks always talk about state and local as if it's one thing. I think it is quite a range of scales and responsibilities and so forth. And I think that that's part of why I think federal folks need to look more at local practice and state practice just to see. So most states are big enough that it doesn't make sense to engage with the state as a whole. And a lot of counties are big enough too, where you want to engage with a specific agency or department that does the thing that you want to do. And you want to figure out what legislator is interested in that area or who the actual secretary is and who they see as their direct constituents. It takes a lot of, I always want to say social work, which isn't the right term because social work is an actual profession, but using your social and research capacities to figure out how to navigate the organization.
I'm going to combine 2 questions, which I think are related from the Q&A box. Ed asks, can you talk more about burnout and where and how you see self-care best practices being implemented? And someone who hasn't listed their name asks, what are some of the common mistakes you see these days in the civic tech ecosystem? What recommendations do you have for folks who may see themselves or those they know in those mistakes?
So I still see a lot of the same mistakes as I made, some of which are like, if I show up and I do a great design, that's all I need to do. I'm not interested in the politics. As it turns out, trying to shift the practice of an institution like a government that may be centuries old is a political act by nature. And in particular, if you are, and I hope you are, trying to shift it in a way that it does better justice, to the community as a whole or to particular communities, it's a political act. And so not owning the political piece of what we do doesn't have to be partisan, but it is in fact political. It's about convincing people and showing a way to somewhere different and sometimes negotiating. Um, those are really important skills for what we do. And I think we neglect them at our peril. I think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake to think that we are in any way smarter or better than career public servants because we have spent some time in the tech industry. Um, and I still see that one sometimes. So I try to remember how much I have learned from public servants over the last 10 years that I would never have learned at another um, part of the tech industry. Um, and then lots of us have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility, which is great, but it can lead to burnout. There is so much good work that we could do. It is never going to be finished in the context of any of our careers. And feeling like we can't stop or undertaking a project that we really don't have the staff or capacity to complete without exhaustion. Um, Sometimes you have to, it's an emergency. I don't know if anybody's on here from one of the teams that got COVID information sites up in the middle of March in 2 or 3 days over a weekend. That was a really good use of overtime and extra work. Um, but just keeping things going or sometimes keeping brigades going. I know a lot of people have gotten burned out running brigades, so sending you all love and care. Um, uh, and I will say that after I did my almost a year as chief of staff of 18F during a period when 18F was under threat of shutdown on a pretty regular basis, it took me almost 2 years to be able to read back through my weekly reflections without my heart racing. And when I joined my next job at the courts, which I was really quite excited about, I could still feel that I was just carrying a lot of drag. I had burned through, not just intellectual capacity, but emotional capacity in dealing with this. So the things that helped me not get all the way to the point where, I had to, um, undertake inpatient care or, less severely require the kind of vacation where you can't speak to anyone for 3 weeks in order to recover yourself. Um, we're networks like this, like all of you, like being able to talk with other people in civic tech, being able to talk with other people from my core discipline, like user researchers, and have them check whether what I was doing made sense and whether my sense that this was a really strange situation was in fact on point. And then just people that I'm close to keeping an eye on me. So in my case, I'm married. Um, I ask my husband to read my reflections sometimes and be like, do I sound like me? Do I sound okay to you? Because I'm having a hard time telling. And a couple times he was like, you don't seem great. I'm going to shut you down for the weekend. And, we're going to have some time to restore you. I see Carlos saying it feels like it's never enough. And I think that's really, really common in civic tech. Like we haven't finished it. One of the other things I like to do is extend our timeline. I think a lot of us felt circa 2012, like if we gave this a good 3 to 5 years, we would advance things a whole lot. And I think we actually have. There's a great saying about the the common mistake of overestimating what you can do in 1 year, but underestimating what you can do in 10. But what we're trying to do in terms of changing how centuries-old institutions respond to their constituents across an institution, if you want to call government as a thing, an institution that employs several million people in the United States, a significant portion of the population, during an era of incredible political strife. I like to think of that as a 50-year project. And I think it helps us to think of it that way because I'm not going to do all of the 50-year project. I am close to 50 years old myself, and I will probably stop this before I'm 100, if I make it that far. And so thinking about what I can do in a couple of years and how I can hand it off, and where I can take a break and know that all of you are out there doing something. And if I go do something else for 3 months or 6 months, I'll probably come back and you all have done a bunch of cool stuff. And it's okay. And especially if I write down things about what I've learned or about my projects or what I've done, I'll make that available to everybody else who can say, oh, wow, you know, Cyd had something really not work out with the courts. And it's really interesting that we can learn from that. So those are my burnout strategies and some of the mistakes that I think are endemic to our field and also part of what makes burnout endemic in our field. It's a good combination of questions.
I think that's really good advice. And I want to echo the love sent to brigades dealing with burnout. You know, you all are doing this on your nights and weekends, and there is a lot to be done. So, you know, thank you for your work, and we need you to keep doing it. So make sure you take a break when you need to. Let's see, I'll go to a question from Barb. Barb says, I've been exploring policing data. Very often issues are raised around race and gender in data. Are there efforts to redefine the kind of categories government uses in data collection?
I would guess that there are, but I don't know much about them. Data is less my area.
Fair enough. Here's a question that is close to my heart as a somewhat non-technical person. Semi asks, where do you think folks who are non-technical, i.e. project management folks, et cetera, fit in the movement of civic tech? Any recommendations for what they should prioritize when upskilling in order to provide more value?
This is a fantastic question. Depending on what room I'm in, I'm not technical either. So I have worked in the technology industry for my entire career, but engineers would generally not consider what I do to be technical. Government desperately needs product management. And anybody out there who has, for example, legal or journalistic skills, those transfer incredibly well to some of the things that need to be done. Working with regulations, figuring out hiring job classes, doing some of the hands-on work that is messy, like what USDS did when they just said, okay, we're going to get 3 people. Actually, I don't know how many people it was, but they sat down and they read the federal acquisition regulations, all 2,000 pages of it, and pulled out everything that had to do with technology and wrote the TechFAR, their guide to what are the actual rules around technology purchasing, because there were a lot of myths about them and they were feeling like they could do everybody a service by debunking anything that was a myth and making clear anything that was a real regulation so that people could do the right thing. So I think, you know, in terms of tech skills to pick up, content design and user research are accessible to people who have strong communication skills on the listening or the writing side. Modern web coding is in some ways harder than it used to be and in some ways easier than it used to be. So figuring out what parts you like, if you start putting together little websites from commercial components and then thinking about whether you want to learn more about that sort of thing. Project and product managers are needed. They are different things. Product management in particular is a government skill gap that I am really excited to see getting filled more and more.
Yeah, I think when I talk most of the groups I talk to are brigades, not necessarily government organizations, but yeah, the same idea of product and project management being the hardest roles to fill are echoed in the brigades. Um, Speaking for myself, as someone who has been a sort of project manager-ish or a program manager my whole career, I was a little bit intimidated when I first started showing up to Code for Boston
Yeah.
hack nights. And this is despite like being friends with several of the people who were the organizers of that. Just I didn't know how I could participate, but um, just showing up and finding out. Most brigade folks that I have run into are incredibly welcoming and
Yeah.
would love to have you, even if you don't know yet how you can participate.
Yes. And one of the other things is that, if you're partnering closely with government folks, helping understand, like Molly McLeod, who was a Code for America fellow in 2014, did this amazing service by helping government staff create nice flyers in Microsoft Word, because that was a tool that was available to them. And she was a very experienced designer. And she said, okay, I can help you put together something that actually looks good with the tool that you have. So if you have, strong skills with modern productivity tools, you can often help people advance their practice even with what they've got on the ground. There's a question about breaking into government product management.
Yes, so I will, Chris asks in chat, how can someone interested in getting into product management in government break in? I will let you answer, Cyd, but I just saw a post on the Code for America Slack from one of our product managers with a big list of great resources. So while you answer the question,
great.
I will find that link.
Yeah, so I would say a number of the larger organizations have kind of the recognizable engineering design product triad as the basis of their teams. So if you look at the two federal services, the state digital services that are established, some of the bigger city teams like San Francisco or Boston or Philadelphia have actual product positions. So do those new school vendors like Nava, Ad Hoc, TrustWorks, those kind of folks. And when we think about federal stuff too, it's worth noting that USDS had a smart strategy of burrowing into agencies. So there is a HHS group that is basically a digital service. There's a defense digital service that absolutely loves to hire veterans in technical roles like product management. And a lot of these groups are more open to remote hiring than they were before the pandemic. If your local city isn't that advanced yet, there are interesting possibilities. It's usually a position called a business systems analyst or something like that. And if you have an understanding partner, sometimes there can be one BSA role that's designated to be a product role, or sometimes they can even do it for a UX role. But you can figure at that point that you will be teaching product thinking and helping people figure out, what that means and what its implications are in their organization. One of my colleagues, Nikki Lee from 18F, has written some great stuff on the 18F blog about bringing product thinking to government.
There's a related question about sort of civic tech careers in the Q&A box from Micah. Micah asks, how or do you see a role for more legacy government jobs pipelines like AmeriCorps or advanced civic, like AmeriCorps to advance civic tech and opportunities, especially for junior level folks, particularly in capacity building work?
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea. I actually had a conversation last week with somebody who wanted to make a proposal to the transition team about basically creating a core of people who could help smaller governments and smaller agencies with tech basics, but basics including things like, making a nice website that has some video production elements, which a lot of people already know how to do with their phones without thinking of themselves as technologists. So there's a kind of, not to use a horrible word, but synergy between some of the things that young Americans these days commonly have learned to do through, social life in the modern era, and some of the gaps that cities have. So there's some thinking about how to match those things up, and maybe have, as we come out of this pandemic, some kind of jobs and training program that brings people's skill levels up, but also brings them to do something with smaller government agencies that have a hard time contracting through traditional means. I haven't heard anything about AmeriCorps, but that would be a great tool to use in that.
Sticking on the career theme, Hannah asks, what about your career or life before you were involved in Civic Tech best prepared you to work in Civic Tech?
The consulting skills I gained from running a user research consulting practice for 6 years. And before that, working at a large company. So at the point when I started getting interested in Civic Tech, I had pretty refined skills for what I like to call asking rude questions politely. You know, if you had to boil my practice down to one sentence, that's probably the core of it. And it's the, you know, it's the, I think often when you are working on a government or civic tech project, it's not fully baked. It's not ready to be executed necessarily. And so the skills to do the definition work will serve anybody in any technical discipline really, really well. And to partner with people to do the definition work without making them feel dumb or backwards or, you know, disrespected.
Yeah, I think that's a really important, I mean, it's an important part of any work, but making sure that you're approaching the work of bridging two sort of different industries or practices.
Huge amount of coaching work in civic tech, and it has to be respectful coaching work, because you're often paired with somebody who is really, really senior and, you know, may just not know a lot about modern tech, but maybe an incredible resource and may have seen 3 groups of people come in and try what you want to do. And if they like you, could tell you what went wrong and how you could avoid it.
Yeah, that is very valuable. There's a question here that I think I can answer, and I will ask Cyd to weigh in as well. John asks, what's the best way to get involved and help out on a very part-time-ish basis if there's not an active brigade near you? John, I would recommend that you check out the Code for America Slack. There are a bunch of projects that multiple brigades are working on across the country. And as of right now, nobody has a brigade meetup near them, or everyone does, because the brigade meetup is on the computer. And I would suggest you go on the Code for America Slack, which you can join. I'll post a link to the sign up link in the chat in a moment. There are folks working on criminal justice projects like Clear My Record stuff. There are a bunch of different projects that are kind of national in nature, and we are sort of actively thinking about how do we make the brigade network accessible to folks who don't happen to live near a brigade and don't have the luxury of time or desire to start their own.
That is usually my best answer to how to onboard into civic tech. But if you feel like you want to go for it, 18F in particular looks for distributed staff, and so do several of those new school consulting agencies. And all of those are good places to onboard in that they have a lot of support and a big posse, rather than sort of trying to start a digital service at your state or taking on a really large project without that kind of backup.
Okay, so Judy asks, how often does change management come up in your projects, if at all? And having read the book, I can say that it at least comes up in the book. Specifically, how do we identify and amplify incentives for public sector folks to change or adopt new technologies, processes, et cetera, when so much that has been written about change management as a methodology is rooted in private sector paradigms?
Yes, and change management in the public sector tends to mean horrible processes with a vendor to change something because you got the requirements wrong when you wrote your 200-page requirements document at the beginning. I think it's an enormous part of the job. I think I refer to as change work a lot, because you're almost always not just trying to do whatever project you're building something or trying to launch, you're trying to instill in your partners the capacity to take on the next one of these on their own, or something like that, or to sustain this one over the long term, or to hire the right kind of people to sustain it. And so there's a lot of change work. You know, one of our exciting touchstones at the courts is that we got a position established called a web content attorney. And that is someone who both has experience as a practicing attorney and working for a court, and is trained in you know, how web content works. Because we ran up against this issue where basically nothing written is authoritative unless it was written by an actual attorney, full stop. We're not going to fix that probably really quickly, and there's a good reason why it's like that. But attorneys and the way that they are trained to work with documents is so distant from the way that web content needs to work with users, that attorneys who aren't trained in it really struggle to meet a typical Californian where they are in terms of language and reading level, and, you know, mobile device internet use and a bunch of things. So that was a piece of, you know, change management that we worked on. So this can't be a consultant position. There has to be an internal position that holds both of these things together, that can be broadly respected by the great majority of people who work here, who are attorneys, and their focus is on accuracy and the law. So yeah, I think it is a huge part. It doesn't end up being something that I formally think about, but I feel like it's probably a large percentage of what I do every day. It's just, you know, answer questions about whether X is reasonable and how we might set up Y for the future, and who should be involved if we're thinking about a long-term governing board for a Z application.
I will combine two questions again. So my colleague Ben asks, are there any particular types of collaborations or shared efforts between civic tech entities, federal, state, nonprofit, consultancy, brigade, that you would like to see more of? And I will tack on sort of the inverse of that, or a related question. What success or failure have you seen with civic tech volunteers working with smart cities vendors?
I don't have any direct experience with specifically volunteers working with specifically smart cities vendors. I think Code for America alum Ariel Kennan was for a while heavily involved with the Sidewalk Technologies project in Toronto that was so controversial, and would be a fascinating person to maybe bring in for one of these to talk about that. I would love to see I would love to see more collaboration between old and new parts of the vendor ecosystem. I haven't quite decided yet whether I think, you know, all the old school vendors just have to be burned to the ground and we have to get a new ecosystem, or whether those are capable of change. And one of the really impactful change management projects we could try is to improve that ecosystem of companies that work with the government. There have been some interesting acquisitions over the last few years of civic startups that you know, ended up getting acquired by Untitled Technologies or Socrata, or one of the big government tech vendors that we don't quite think of as civic tech. And sorry, I am thumbs upping someone to come into this room, which has the printer, and grab a printout. So I would just like to see the big piece that I think we have a real separation from in all of these versions of civic tech is from academics who study government and academics who study tech, science and technology studies, the tech critique. There are some intersections, but there's such a wide gulf between the sort of user research that I often participate in and, you know, really well-grounded academic trials of policy stuff. And those things should be working together for longer term change. So I guess that would be my number one pick for who I'd like to see collaborate more.
So at the beginning of the event, you talked a little bit about the Civic Tech bookshelf, and that's sort of an idea that you had mentioned when we were chatting before this event. Sam asks a question in chat: what's your canon of your favorite books that have influenced your thinking and what associations do you participate in, and what things or people do you follow that you find most valuable. I will mention there at the end of the book, there's a great list of some resources, but I think, if we can put organizations and associations and things like that on the Civic Tech bookshelf, what might that bookshelf look like?
Oh, that's a good question. I am not a heavy joiner. Um, so I don't have like formal membership in a whole lot of organizations. But I do sometimes go to, I go to conferences, I keep my professional connections with research organizations. Um, there are quite a few books and articles in the field, so some of them are in the book, but I'll mention a couple. Atul Gawande's Slow Ideas article, something that I would try to get everyone who wanted to work in this field to read. It's about, how difficult change happens. And I think that it's actually called Spreading Slow Ideas. That's the title. And a lot of my touchstones are science fiction. I'm a person who processes through fiction, and I think a lot about, I've been thinking a lot lately about two books, one of them new and one of them kind of old and obscure, that apply to our current situation where we have a whole bunch of Americans who seem to be operating in an alternate reality. One of those books, the older one, is called Wave Without a Shore by Cyd Harrell. And it's about a planet that humans have colonized. They say they found it empty, but everybody who visits who's not kind of from the main human cultural sphere finds that it's actually full of aliens, presumably native to the planet, wearing indigo robes and walking through the streets. And the humans have trained themselves not to attend to the presence of these people. It's a heavy metaphor maybe, but an interesting book. And then Susanna Clark's new book, her first book since Dr. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which was a long time ago, is called Piranesi. And it is about a very strange world. And you start to discover as the book goes on that maybe not everybody intended to be there. And maybe the people who were there didn't quite realize that they were separated from the world that they expected to be in when they first traveled there. I don't think it solves anything, but I like to read things that make me think. I read a fair amount of cyberpunk, and I think about it as a warning more than a manual. I tweet this fairly often. Cyberpunk is a warning, not a manual. But when you think about books like Neuromancer and Snow Crash and some of that classic cyberpunk and a lot of newer cyberpunk like Malka Alder's work. When it's really about networked software and the ways that networked software can go wrong. And I think it's really interesting for those of us who work in network software and want to bring more of our foundational institutions into it to think about some of the ways that it can go wrong. And just because it's like the best thing that's come out in a long time, if you haven't read N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy, which won 3 successive Hugos for each book, you should read that just because it's amazing.
One thing that I will add on the question of organizations, less fun than sci-fi informing how we think of it, but there is another organization called the Metro Lab Network. They actually also have an annual conference called Summit, but they are a network of city-university partnerships.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah, it's not, unless you work at a city or a university, it's not super directly relevant, but I think it's a great resource. If you look at the list of members, it's a great resource to find cities and universities doing really interesting work that is at the very least Civic Tech adjacent, if not like deep in Civic Tech. So that's the Metro Lab Network. I would suggest checking that out.
Yeah, I think the Beck Center, who I should disclose, sponsored the book and gave me a project completion grant so that I could do the paperback version, which interestingly has turned out to be more popular. I thought lots of people would want to buy the cheaper electronic versions, but about 80% of the sales so far have been in paperback, which is kind of cool because I think that Oxide Design did a tremendous job of designing it. It's a nice object. But the Beck Center is trying to build this as a field. They're calling it public interest tech, slightly different term, but they have a survey in the field right now, actually, that if you look at their Twitter, you'll find that's about what do you need as someone who works in this area? What kind of professional supports do you need? What would you like to have as continuing education? So those, yeah, that's spreading slow ideas, Ted. So they are doing some interesting stuff. And I think they are also intending to engage not just academically, but with folks in industry that are kind of meant to be a bridge organization too.
Great. Well, one sort of similar resource that I always find is a fun time capsule. Back in 2013, the Knight Foundation made a sort of an interactive web app thing that was a map of civic tech organizations.
Oh, I remember that thing. Yes.
It's still online, and it lists sort of like crowd sharing, like it lists Uber and Airbnb as part of this because it's sort of sourced. So
that's the sharing economy was seen initially as mutual aid.
So just
that's interesting to reflect on.
Yeah, like Civic Tech map or Civic Tech directory or something. It's a fun. Yes, thank you, Hannah, for posting that in the chat. It's a fun little time capsule. So I will pause for a moment for any other questions. I had one sort of fun question that was asked that I wanted to save for the close. But if anybody else had questions, well, I'll ask the question, and you touched on it very briefly, but Sam asked, what does the cover of the book mean to you? What is it inspired by?
I actually, so I hired a design agency to do it because I am not that kind of designer. And I asked for something that really would reflect civic technology. And they gave me 3 choices, one of which was a flag that was made out of a form, which was pretty cool. And another one looked much more like a map, a very abstract street map. And then this one, which if you haven't seen it, I have a copy right here. So it looks like this. On a screen, I'm not sure it'll read quite well if you don't have full color perception, but it's effectively a flag made up of a corner and a rest of the flag, made out of little blue and orange bits, the blue in the corner and the orange in the rest, that are connected together as if they're a flow chart. And there's several elements to it, one of which is that it looks like a rock climbing wall, representing some of the difficulty of the paths that we take and what we need to do. The other one, of course, the flag and patriotism. And I really hoped that I was publishing this book into the teeth of a new administration. After I had put out the cover and announced the book, Mark Trammell, who's a friend of mine from a long time back and was my colleague at 18F and is a Navy veteran, said, "Hey, Cyd, do you know that the flag on your book is in a distress position? And did you do that on purpose? Did you mean it as a call for help?" And I said, I didn't, but I actually really like the idea that it is, especially this year, it's a call for help. It's a recognition of, the many things that we're trying to connect. It looks a bit like programming. It looks a bit like a rock climbing wall. So yeah, sticky notes work for me too, Joseph. So it can be a lot of things. And initially it was the one I liked the least. And they had said to me, sleep on it. We're not going to give you any advice as to which one you should pick. And I slept on it and showed it to a few people and realized how many of the concepts that were important to me it encapsulated. So I can't shout them out enough for that design. They're a firm that has done a lot of civic tech work on ballots and tax forms and the field guides to ensuring voter intent, if any of you know those, which are an awesome little piece of work by the Center for Civic Design. So it was really great to work with them.
That's great. I had not seen the climbing wall, but now that you mention it, I see it. You lose the flag on the black and white version, but you still.
Yeah, it's got a little bit of contrast, but not quite enough. Yeah.
Um, great. Well, I think that that about wraps it up. Thank you all so much for joining. This has been a lot of fun, and I think a really great way to close out the year. As I mentioned before, you are welcome to join the Code for America Slack if you're not already there, although I imagine many folks already are. I posted the link to that above. Let's see if it's still on my clipboard. It sure is. So just posted that again in chat. So we hope to see you there. Come say hi on the Brigade channel. That is sort of where a lot of folks that are involved in this from the Brigade side hang out. You can follow Cyd on Twitter at Cyd Harrell. That is I find a great way to keep up with her thoughts and occasional
I
haikus.
swear a lot on there, so come and
It's
join me.
okay. It's the internet. You're allowed to swear. But thank you so much for spending this time with us. Are there any closing thoughts you want to leave us with, or anything you want to plug, suggest?
Just thank you all for the work that we're doing, and that we're doing together and that you're doing individually, and think about when it's time for you to write your book.
I think that's great advice. Yeah, well, with that, we will close up. As I mentioned at the beginning, this has been recorded. I will get it posted on the Code for America YouTube page by the end of the week, and we'll update the discourse page and throw it on Slack as well. So I hope to see you all there, and I hope you all have a great week. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Cyd.
Pandemic hugs to all of you.